He learned early that a stadium can sound like a confession booth. Under the white heat of '80s neon, a young man raised his hands to the crowd and felt, in the thunder of adoration, the quiet of a secret. He wore faith like a leather jacket, sold freedom on a chorus that every radio memorized, and smiled for cameras that never blinked. But music is a mirror, and his songs kept reflecting a truth he could not yet say aloud. There were nights when applause outlasted sleep, when headlines learned his name before understanding his heart, when a single moment in a silent room would turn the world from anthem to whisper. The boy from North London, the son with old country roots, the hitmaker who conquered America, kept walking a narrow corridor between light and shadow, fame and privacy, myth and the man. Listen closely. Beneath the hook, beneath the bass, beneath the unbroken polish of a perfect pop image, there is a hush that keeps returning. These are the whispers behind the music. Before the silence, there was sound radiant, unstoppable, and unmistakably his. George Michael was not just a pop idol. He was the pulse of a generation that danced its way out of the 1,970 seconds into the bright confusion of the 1,980 seconds. With Wham! He gave the world joy wrapped in color and rhythm. Wake Me Up Before You Go, Everything She Wants. Last Christmas songs that made even loneliness feel alive. Then came Faith Leather Jacket, Jukebox, Sunglasses, Rebellion, a declaration that he was no longer a boy sharing a stage, but an artist demanding to be heard. Yet for every beat of triumph, there was a quiet ache of isolation. The industry that crowned him also confined him. His image, sharp, perfect, marketable, became a gilded cage. Behind that polished smile was a man struggling with identity, privacy, and the price of being adored. To the world, he was the voice of freedom. To himself, he was a whisper trying to find its way through the noise. Let's step beyond the lights, beyond the posters, and beyond the platinum records into the silence that defined the man more than any melody ever could. He was born Georgios Kyriakos Panayiotou, a name that carried the rhythm of two worlds. The son of a Greek Cypriot restaurateur and an English dancer, George grew up in North London with a head full of melodies and a quiet certainty that music would be his escape. At school, he met Andrew Ridgeley, the boy who would become his partner in ambition and the other half of a dream called Wham! Together, they turned youth itself into an anthem, the sound of optimism in a decade that worshipped image. Their songs weren't just pop, they were rebellion dressed as joy. In 1985, Wham! Became the first Western pop act to perform in China, a symbolic collision of East and West, light and control. George stood on that stage in Beijing, watching thousands of strangers move to his voice, and for the first time felt the terrifying weight of being seen. He had the fame every artist wanted, but not yet the identity he could live with. When Wham! Ended, the world thought it was a victory lap. But for George, it was something quieter, the end of pretending. The boy who sang for freedom was about to discover that freedom always has a price. Success should have been the reward. Instead, it became the disguise. When George Michael released Faith in 1987, he was no longer just a star, he was an empire. His voice ruled radios, his image filled every billboard, and his songs turned into commandments for an entire generation. The leather jacket, the cross earring, the sway of his hips, all symbols of confidence. Yet every symbol hid a secret. The man selling freedom on vinyl was trapped in a life choreographed by fear. Behind the album covers and chart records, the weight of expectation grew unbearable. Sony's marketing machine built him as the perfect heterosexual idol, something the real George could not be. He watched his own face turned into a mask, his every word measured against an image he didn't choose. The world adored him, but that adoration demanded silence. Each love song became a coded confession, each lyric a plea disguised as melody. "I think there's something you should know," he sang, but the world wasn't ready to listen. Fame had given him a voice. Now, it was taking away his right to use it. In April 1998, a single moment in a quiet Los Angeles park shattered the illusion. George Michael, the icon, the perfection, the untouchable voice, was arrested in a sting operation that tabloids devoured like blood. Within hours, his secret was no longer whispered but shouted across headlines. The mask had been ripped away, not by choice, but by humiliation. The industry that once worshipped him recoiled. Contracts tightened, radio stations hesitated, and reporters circled like vultures. For most, it would have been the end. For George, it became the turning point. He refused to bow to shame. Instead, he turned scandal into art. The single Outside, released months later, was his answer, a disco confession wrapped in irony and defiance. The video mocked his own arrest, transforming a police sting into a dance floor of liberation. But liberation came at a cost. The press never forgave him. Every appearance, every silence, was dissected. The man who once filled arenas now hid from flashbulbs. Yet, in that isolation, he found something more enduring than applause: authenticity. The fall had stripped away the illusion, leaving only truth. And for the first time, George Michael was no longer a product. He was a person wounded, but finally real. The years that followed felt like a long winter, quiet, unpredictable, and heavy with memory. George retreated from the spotlight he once owned, trading stages for solitude. His world shrank to the walls of his London home, where music became both comfort and confession. He battled illnesses that the press exaggerated, dependencies they mocked, and loneliness they mistook for arrogance. Each hospital stay became a headline, each silence a rumor. But behind closed doors, those who truly knew him spoke of something else: kindness that never asked for credit, generosity that refused recognition. He donated millions in secret, called fans in grief, and sent money to strangers who'd written him letters of despair. The tabloids called him troubled. His friends called him human. On Christmas morning, 2016, the music stopped. George Michael was found in his bed, peaceful, alone, leaving behind questions that would never be answered. Some said heart failure, others whispered darker theories. But maybe the truth was simpler. A voice that had carried too much weight finally went quiet. That night, radios across Britain played Last Christmas. The irony was haunting: the man who gave the world its holiday joy had chosen the quietest night of all to leave it. In the silence that followed his passing, the world finally began to listen, not to the gossip, not to the headlines, but to the music. Songs once dismissed as pop perfection revealed layers of ache, compassion, and defiance. Jesus to a child, a hymn to a lost lover. Praying for time, a plea for empathy in a world obsessed with image. Freedom 90, a rebellion against the machinery that had built and broken him. Each track, in hindsight, sounded like a page from an unspoken diary. George Michael's legacy was not in the records he sold, but in the courage he left behind. He became a quiet patron of humanity, donating anonymously to charities, funding hospitals, paying debts for strangers he'd never meet. In an age of spectacle, he practiced secrecy as kindness. The world that once judged him for his truth would later honor him for his honesty. His name returned not as scandal, but as solace, the artist who turned shame into strength and solitude into song. He sang of love as salvation, of truth as liberation, and long after the cameras dimmed, his voice remained steady, forgiving, eternal. Fame made him visible. Compassion made him unforgettable. Fame had always promised eternity, but for George Michael, it came wrapped in silence. He stood beneath the brightest lights of his generation, adored, envied, defined, yet his truest moments were the ones unseen. Behind every award was a wound, behind every anthem, a confession. He lived in the echo between freedom and fear, where truth was both a burden and a gift. In the end, he became what all artists dream of but rarely achieve: a mirror. His life reflected the beauty and fragility of those who chase love through noise and never stop searching for peace in its aftermath. The world had taken his image, dissected his secrets, and called it fame. But when the music faded, what remained was gentleness, a reminder that even broken voices can heal the ones who listen. Maybe fame is only the first act. Maybe the real story begins when the applause ends. Because long after the lights go dark, what endures are not the headlines, but the whispers. His story reminds us that fame is never the full song, only the first verse. Behind every perfect performance lies a silence few ever hear, a truth few dare to speak. George Michael gave that silence a voice. He taught us that freedom is not about being adored, but about being honest even when the world isn't ready for it. Which of his songs still echoes in your memory? Which lyric still feels like it was written for you? Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your truths below, because stories like his deserve to be remembered not with noise, but with empathy.